People go camping to feel small in the best way, to trade walls and locks for open sky, to sleep somewhere the noise of the world cannot reach. But the same distance that makes the wild feel like freedom is the distance that makes it dangerous. There is no one nearby. There is no quick way out. A tent is a thin layer of fabric, and a remote campsite keeps no record of what happens inside it, except the people who were there. Sometimes that is a bear that learned to associate humans with food. Sometimes it is a stranger who followed a trail to a place where no one could hear. The stories that follow are not about reckless people. Most of them did things right. Here are 5 of the most horrifying camping deaths ever. It was the night of August 13th, 1967, in Glacier National Park, Montana. In 57 years, no one had ever been killed by a grizzly bear inside the park. That night, 2 young women would die in 2 separate attacks, about 10 miles apart, within hours of each other. Nothing like it had happened before in North America, and statisticians later called the odds of 2 unrelated fatal maulings in one night essentially beyond measure. Julie Helgeson was 19, from Albert Lee, Minnesota, one of the seasonal workers who staffed the lodges and chalets in the park's high country every summer. That night, she hiked up toward the Granite Park Chalet with her boyfriend, Roy Duca, and the 2 of them bedded down in their sleeping bags at an informal campsite about a quarter-mile below the chalet. They had no idea that their spot sat almost on top of a path worn smooth by bears. For weeks, those bears had been climbing up at night to feed on the garbage the chalet dumped down a nearby gully, and rangers had watched them doing it just days before. Around midnight, Helgeson woke and whispered to Ducat that a bear was close and that they should lie still and pretend to be dead. They tried. The bear came anyway. It bit into Ducat first, then turned on Helgeson, and the 2 teenagers were mauled where they lay. Ducat, badly hurt, managed to break away and stagger toward other campers for help. Behind him, the bear seized Helgeson and dragged her screaming into the dark. Rescuers searching by flashlight found her roughly 400 feet down the slope. She was alive when they reached her and conscious enough to speak, but the injuries were catastrophic, and she died before she could be carried out. 10 miles away, near the shore of Trout Lake, 19-year-old Michelle Coons of San Diego, California, was camping with 4 friends, all of them workers from Lake McDonald Lodge. The Trout Lake campground had become a problem the rangers knew about. One witness described it as a battlefield, strewn with discarded rations, and crews would later haul nearly 20 bags of garbage out by helicopter. A scrawny, food-conditioned grizzly had been prowling there for days. Sometime around 4 in the morning, the bear walked into their camp. One of the campers woke first to the feeling of the animal sniffing along the outside of her sleeping bag. She held perfectly still, barely breathing, and the bear moved past her. Then it reached Coons. She woke and screamed, and in an instant, the camp dissolved into panic, 5 young people clawing their way out of their bags and up the nearest trees. 4 of them made it. Coons did not. The zipper on her sleeping bag jammed, and in the seconds that mattered most, she could not get free. She was trapped inside the very thing meant to keep her warm, pinned to the ground while her friends climbed just out of reach above her. They heard her cry out that the bear was pulling at her arm, that it was tearing her apart, and then it dragged her out of the camp and into the trees. From their branches, the others could do nothing but cling and listen until the sound stopped. They stayed up there in the dark for more than 2 hours, too terrified to climb down, waiting for the first gray light before they ran for help. By the time anyone reached the spot, Michelle Coons was dead. Both deaths traced back to the same root cause. For years, the park had let bears feed on human garbage, even staging trash near a chalet as a viewing attraction for guests. The animals lost their fear of people and learned to associate the smell of humans with food. In the days after, rangers shot several bears at both sites. A post-mortem on one emaciated grizzly near Trout Lake, its gums embedded with glass, confirmed it as Coons's killer. The night forced a complete overhaul of how the National Park Service managed bears. Bear-proof containers, cables for hanging food, separated cooking and sleeping areas, and limits on where people could camp. Much of modern backcountry safety was written in the aftermath of that single night. It was the early morning of June 5, 1960, on the shore of Lake Bodom, near Espoo, Finland. 4 teenagers had pitched a single tent at the water's edge to spend the weekend together. By late morning, 3 of them were dead, and the survivor could remember almost nothing. More than 60 years later, no one has ever been convicted, and it remains the most notorious crime in Finnish history. The 4 were ordinary teenagers out for a summer weekend. Mila Bjorklund was 15, Anja Maki was also 15. Seppo Boisman was 18, and so was Niels Gustafsson, who was Bjorklund's boyfriend. The 2 couples had ridden out to the lake on motorcycles, pitched a single tent on the shore, and settled in for the night. The kind of trip thousands of Finnish teenagers took every year without a second thought. Sometime between roughly 4 and 6 in the morning, someone came out of the dark and attacked them. The killer struck from outside the tent, slashing and stabbing through the canvas and beating the teenagers as they tried to react inside the cramped space. Mila Bjorklund, Anja Maki, and Seppo Boisman were stabbed and bludgeoned to death with a knife and a blunt object. Bjorklund's body was found on top of the collapsed tent, having been moved or dragged. Only Niels Gustafsson lived. He was discovered lying on the fallen tent with fractures to his skull and the bones of his face, and with stab wounds, badly concussed and unable to give any coherent account of what had happened to him or to his 3 friends. The bodies were not discovered until around 11 that morning. Boys who were out birdwatching near the lake noticed the wrecked campsite and the still figures around it, and a carpenter passing the area was drawn to the same scene. By then, hours had gone by since the attack, and the killer was long gone. What happened next damaged the case beyond any hope of repair. Police did not cordon off the area. They did not carefully record the position of the bodies or the tent. Officers, curious locals, and others were allowed to walk through and around the site almost as soon as it was found, trampling the ground and handling and moving things before anyone had documented how they lay. In an era before modern forensics could have recovered fibers, prints, or blood patterns from an undisturbed scene, the single best chance to read what had happened at Lake Bodom was destroyed in the first hours after the bodies were found. Everything that came afterward, every theory and every suspect, had to be built on top of that ruined foundation. Suspects accumulated for decades, and each one eventually slipped away. The most enduring was Carl Gillstrom, a local kiosk operator who lived near the lake and was said to despise the young people who camped and made noise on the shore near his stand. He drowned in 1969 in what some believed was a suicide, and a handful of accounts claimed he had as good as confessed to people close to him before he died. Years later, a man with a violent record claimed responsibility for the killings, but he had been only 14 years old at the time, and his story collapsed under scrutiny. One by one, the theories rose and fell. None of them ever held together into a case that could be brought to court. Then, in 2004, the investigation turned in a direction no one expected. After more than 40 years, police arrested the lone survivor, Niels Gustafsson, and charged him with the murders of his 3 friends. Prosecutors argued the killings had been personal rather than the work of a passing stranger, building a case around old evidence and new interpretation. Gustafsson stood trial in 2005. On October 7, 2005, he was acquitted of all charges. The court did not find the case against him persuasive, and he walked free. The murders at Lake Bodom remain officially unsolved. The tent and the lake fixed permanently in Finnish memory as the country's defining unsolved horror. It was the night of April 11th into the morning of April 12th, 1981, in Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort, a cluster of rental cabins tucked into the Sierra Nevada of Plumas County, California. It was the kind of place families went to get away, quiet, wooded, far from the nearest town. What happened inside one of those cabins that night was so brutal and so completely unsolved that it has haunted Northern California for more than 40 years. Glenna Sue Sharp, known as Sue, was 36. She had moved to Keddie with her 5 children to start over, renting one of the small wooden cabins in the resort. That night, her teenage son, John, 15, was home. along with John's friend Dana Wingate, 17. The two boys had spent the evening out and were last seen hitchhiking back toward Keddie late in the night. Sometime after they returned, the cabin became the scene of something almost impossible to comprehend. Sue, John, and Dana were bound with medical tape and electrical cord and then beaten and stabbed to death. The attackers used 2 knives and a claw hammer, and one of the knives was found bent from the force of the blows. The violence inside that small cabin was extreme and sustained, the work of more than a few seconds. Sue was stabbed in the chest and throat and struck repeatedly. John's throat was cut. Dana died from a combination of strangulation and blunt force injuries to the head. The 3 of them were left where they fell, in the front room of a vacation cabin in the mountains, while in the next room, 3 children remained alive. In an adjoining bedroom, 3 young children either slept through it or were deliberately left alive. 2 of Sue's younger sons and a friend who was staying over. They were physically unharmed, a fact that has unsettled people for decades, because it means the killers passed by a room full of children and chose not to touch them. One of those boys would later give investigators conflicting accounts of the night, at one point describing things he said he had seen happen, and at another insisting he had only dreamed them. Whether he had witnessed part of the attack, or heard it through the wall, or simply absorbed the horror of waking into it, was never resolved. The handling of his statements, including composite sketches of possible suspects drawn by an untrained artist at a time when professional forensic resources were available, became one of a long list of investigative decisions in the case that were never adequately explained. The bodies were found the next morning, around 10, when Sheila, Sue's 14-year-old daughter, came home after spending the night at a neighbor's cabin. She opened the door to the scene and ran for help, and then came the detail that turned a massacre into a decades-long obsession. One person was missing. Tina Sharp, Sue's 12-year-old daughter, was gone. She was not among the dead in the cabin, and she was nowhere to be found. For 3 years there was no answer. Then, in April 1984, a bottle collector found a human skull near Feather Falls, roughly 62 miles from Keddie, and further remains were recovered nearby. They were identified as Tina. How and exactly when she died, and why she alone had been carried away from the cabin while the 3 younger children were left untouched, was never established. The discovery answered the question of where she was and deepened every other question about that night. Investigators came to focus on a neighbor named Martin Smart, a man who lived close by, whose stepson had been one of the surviving children in the cabin, and whose own statements and behavior drew suspicion in the years that followed. Some accounts described a note and remarks that pointed toward his involvement, but he was never arrested, and he died years later without ever being charged. Decades on, with cold case reviews and modern forensic testing applied to old evidence, the Keddie Cabin murders remain officially unsolved, a case remembered as much for the failures of its investigation as for the horror of the crime itself. It was July 30th, 1984, in the Pelican Valley of Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, some of the most remote backcountry in the lower 48. Brigitte Friedenhagen, known as Britta, was 24 years old and had come from Basel, Switzerland. She was an experienced hiker, comfortable in wild places, and she had set out to camp alone in country that few people ever see. This is the case that strips away the easy comfort of blame, because by almost every measure, she did everything she was supposed to do. Britta understood bear country. After cooking her evening meal, she did not eat or store food anywhere near where she would sleep. She carried her food away from the tent, then hoisted it up and suspended it between 2 trees, the recommended method for keeping it out of a bear's reach. She had taken the precautions the rangers and the guidebooks asked for. She crawled into her tent for the night believing she had put the proper distance between herself and the wild around her. Sometime in the dark, a young grizzly came to the camp. Investigators later determined it was only 2 or 3 years old, a bear still learning how to survive on its own. It found her food bag and climbed high enough to reach it, pulling it down from between the 2 trees where she had hung it out of reach. Whatever first drew the animal to the site, once it had taken her food there, it did not move on. It went to the tent. It pulled Britta out from inside and killed her, and it consumed much of her body before it left. There was no one within miles, no friend asleep in the next tent, no campground neighbor close enough to hear a sound, no ranger station within reach of a shout. She had wanted the solitude of true backcountry, and the same emptiness that made the place beautiful meant that when the bear came, she was completely alone with it. She was reported missing the following day when she failed to appear, and when rangers finally reached the site, they found the torn and flattened remains of the tent and the scattered evidence of what had happened around it. This was the first person killed by a bear in Yellowstone since 1972, and it carried weight precisely because Britta had not been careless. The National Park Service convened an official board of investigation to reconstruct exactly what had happened. The board reached a conclusion that was, in its way, more disturbing than negligence would have been. It found that Britta had taken the necessary precautions for hiking and camping in bear country, including suspending her food between two trees. The problem was that the young grizzly had simply been able to climb high enough to retrieve the food bag anyway, and the board believed that food contributed directly to the attack. That conclusion is what makes the case linger. In most fatal bear attacks, there is a mistake to point to. A cooler left out, food kept in the tent, a careless camper who never learned the rules. With Britta, there was none of that. She had hung her food the way she was told to hang it, and a bear, young enough to still be growing, had simply been a better climber than the system assumed. The investigators did not look for someone to blame among the living or the dead. They looked at the rules themselves. The board urged the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee to develop better methods for storing food in bear country and to reconsider how close campsites and trails were being allowed to sit to active grizzly habitat. The lesson of Pelican Valley was not that Britta Fredenhagen made a fatal mistake. It was that competence and caution are not the same thing as safety, and that the wild does not grade on effort. She was 24 years old, alone in country she had chosen for its silence, and she had followed the rules to the letter. It was September 13th, 1990, at the Thelma Marks Shelter on Cove Mountain, along the Appalachian Trail in Perry County, Pennsylvania, near the town of Duncannon. The shelter was a simple three-sided lean-to, the kind that thru hikers share for a night before moving on. What happened there became the most infamous murder in the long history of the trail, a crime that made hikers across the country rethink what it meant to feel safe in the backcountry. Molly LaRue was 25, from Ohio. She was an artist whose stamp design had won a national competition and been issued by the Postal Service. She had graduated from Ohio Wesleyan University and worked as an emergency medical technician and an outward-bound instructor. Jeff Hood was 26, from Signal Mountain, Tennessee, with a teaching degree from the University of Tennessee. The two had met working with a church youth program in Kansas. They were in love, planned to marry, and dreamed of starting an organization to help disadvantaged children. In June of 1990, they had begun a southbound thru hike of the Appalachian Trail, traveling under the trail names Nalgene and Clevis. By that September, they had been on the trail for 3 months and had crossed into Pennsylvania. At the Thelma Marks Shelter, on the night of September 12th into September 13th, they crossed paths with Paul David Cruz, a drifter and fugitive wanted in connection with a 1986 homicide in Florida. He was exactly the kind of danger that long-distance hikers almost never imagine, a violent stranger who had drifted onto the trail with nowhere to be and nothing to lose. What he did to the couple was savage. Jeff Hood was shot 3 times with a .22 caliber pistol. Molly LaRue was bound with rope, raped, and stabbed repeatedly in the neck, throat, and back. The two of them, who had walked more than 1,000 miles together and meant to marry, were murdered in a 3-sided shelter in the Pennsylvania woods. Then, Cruz gathered up their belongings and the weapons, walked out of the shelter, and continued down the trail as though he were just another hiker moving south. On the Appalachian Trail, hikers keep track of one another through the registers left at each shelter, notebooks where people write their trail names, the date, a few words about the weather or the miles. It is an informal, trusting system, a way of knowing who is ahead and who is behind you in the wilderness. It was that system that uncovered the murders. Fellow thru hikers who had been following the couple's entries from shelter to shelter reached Thelma Marks and found their bodies. The same register trail that hikers used to feel connected to one another became the thread that led to the scene. Cruz kept moving south, but he made the mistake of carrying the evidence with him. 8 days after the murders, he was arrested in West Virginia, still in possession of the weapons used in the killings and items belonging to the victims. There was little doubt about what investigators had. He was tried and convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and originally sentenced to death. That sentence was later reduced to 2 consecutive life terms, and Paul David Cruz died in prison in 2022 at the age of 70. Having spent more than 3 decades behind bars for what he did in that shelter, the murders reached far beyond the 2 people who died. For a generation of thru-hikers, the killings at Thelma Marks shattered the assumption that the trail community was a safe one, that the registers and the shared shelters and the camaraderie of the path could keep the rest of the world out. The shelter itself was eventually torn down. In 2000, the families in the hiking community helped dedicate a new one on Cove Mountain, rebuilt and renamed in honor of Molly LaRue and Jeff Hood, so that the place forever tied to their deaths would instead carry the names of 2 people who had loved each other enough to walk 1,000 miles side by side.